Let's try an example of this. Here are 5 lines of code. You might notice that the 5th line has an error. I've misspelled the word print. That's why it's not highlighted in purple, because PRITN isn't a recognized function. So what happens when I run this code? Well, it runs line 1, which tells it to print, and so it prints, this is line 1. It runs line 2, which tells it to print, and so it prints, this is line 2. It runs line 3, which tells it to print something, and so it prints, this is line 3. It runs line 4, which tells it to print something, and so it prints, this is line 4. Then it comes to line 5. On line 5, it has a function name that it doesn't recognize. It doesn't know what printin, or however you'd pronounce this, actually means. Again, that's why it's not highlighted. So, what does it do? It generates an error. That's what all this down here is. In Python, our errors start with the word traceback, which is more useful in more complicated programs where we might trace back a lot of different function calls through a lot of code to find out what went wrong. For our purposes, you can generally ignore this and just know if you see the word traceback, it's Python telling you that it hit an error. It then tells you what file it occurred in, which for us will usually only be using one file, so it's the one file that we're using. And it tells us on what line the error occurred. For our purposes, you can ignore a lot of this. You can ignore most recent call last, you can ignore in module. These things won't really apply until you get to more complicated programs. Most importantly, under this, you'll see the line of code that actually generated the error. It'll tell you where the error happened. And then it will tell you what the error actually was. Here it says name error, and it says that the name printin is not defined. In this case, this is just a fancy way of telling us, hey, you misspelled print. The reason we're covering this right here is that when you're just getting started in programming, this can be a really intimidating thing to see. You see a lot of words you don't understand, although it's pretty obvious that it's saying that you did something wrong. Oftentimes this text will actually appear in red, further solidifying that something broke. What's important to note is that's perfectly fine. Breaking things is one of the ways you learn to program. You learn what breaks the computer and what doesn't. So don't get intimidated when you see things like this. Generally, the goal of this is to use the information that it gives us to figure out what was wrong with our program. We'll talk a lot about the kinds of errors we might encounter as we go forward.